Welcome to the Mad in America podcast, your source for science, psychiatry, and social justice. Jazmine Russell is the co-founder of the Institute for the Development of Human Arts, a transformative mental health training institute, and the host of the breathwork podcast. As a writer, educator, and scholar, Jazmine works at the intersection of mad studies, critical psychology, and neuroscience. Her work is deeply informed by her lived experiences surviving complex trauma, psychosis, and an autoimmune disease. Jazmine's focus extends to the intersection of mental health and chronic illness, particularly exploring the overlap of psychosis, trauma, and autoimmunity. This has led her to bridge critical neuroscience communities with the MAD movement. In addition to her scholarly pursuits, Jazmine continues to see clients as a trauma-informed, holotropic breathwork practitioner. She is also a co-editor on the forthcoming MAD Studies reader, Interdisciplinary Innovations in Mental Health, coming out from Routledge this year. Today, we will delve into her background, her journey to founding the Institute, and her current work and podcast, along with the insights she's offering in the upcoming MAD Studies reader. Jazmine, welcome to the Mad in America podcast. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. Big fan of Mad in America.
I was lucky enough to get an advanced copy of some of the chapters coming out in the MAD Studies reader. And in your chapter, Making the Case for Multiplicity, you begin with your first episode of Psychosis and the ensuing crisis of meaning. Can you share with us a little bit about your personal journey on how you came to connect this with complex trauma, psychosis, autoimmune disease, and how these experiences have shaped your path in the mental health field?
So I'll take us back a little bit before my quote unquote first episode of Psychosis. I'm a complex trauma survivor. I've survived childhood sexual abuse, incest, along with a whole slew of other things. And I think, like most of us, that's one of the main drivers or motivations behind my work and what led me to be interested in psychology more broadly. Luckily, though, I did not have any kind of acute encounters with psychiatry. My first encounter with psychiatry was when I had flashback memories of childhood sexual abuse at 17. And for me, these flashback memories kind of marked a huge transition in my life. It was like someone had shut the lights off in my mind, and everything was different after that. And, like one does, and I grew up in the 90s with all those infomercials about, go see a psychiatrist if you're experiencing blah, blah, blah. And so I thought that that's what one does, and I did. And after 15 minutes with psychiatrists telling them about my history of trauma, I left with a prescription for Abilify, a powerful antipsychotic. I was told that I likely had depression, bipolar mania, and potentially schizophrenia, because I was also kind of having occasional instances of catatonic states. And no other information besides that, and just kind of shoved out the door. And even at 17, I had the worldview or the mindset to at least be able to say, holy moly, there is something absolutely so wrong about that experience. So absolutely backwards about how we are treating people. Because I had some faith and trust in my experience, I knew that there wasn't something fundamentally wrong with my brain, that trauma had a huge role to play in my experiences. So fast forward, I wound up going to NYU for applied psychology. It was there that I met Brad Lewis, who was an amazing mentor and psychiatrist and cultural studies professor, who introduced me to the MAD movement, organizations like the Icarus Project. And straight out of school, I was really determined to go work in the public mental health system. So I did. I was a crisis counselor for children and families in a mobile crisis team, home-based crisis team. I just really dove straight into the belly of the beast right from there. It's like, we're doing it. And I knew that there were things that I would disagree with. I knew that there were ways that we approached mental health that I was going to struggle with, but I had no idea the stark reality of what I would find, which was that ultimately I believed that no matter our good intentions, despite, most of us, all of us getting into this field of social work and counseling and psychology, we want to do good. And despite that, the system at times, forces us in some ways or coerces us as practitioners to what I believed was harming people more than helping them. I saw children and families coming out of the inpatient unit, and even though we would take psychosocial assessments and we would learn about their long histories of trauma and what, like, the root causes of why they were experiencing what they were experiencing, I was still told to, quote unquote, psychoeducate people on their disorder, to, send them back to the psychiatric ward at the first mention of suicidality. And ultimately, I felt like we weren't really addressing anyone's deeper concerns. And I felt really complicit in a system that I felt was re-traumatizing people. And as a junior clinician, it was quite traumatizing to me as well. And I found myself looking around thinking, is anyone else seeing this? Like, is anyone else, thinking what I'm thinking here? And this, I joke sometimes and say that this experience really led me to, quote unquote, go crazy, because it was in the midst of that, plus, my own trauma processing, plus other factors that I'll describe in a moment, that really led me to what often gets labeled as the first episode of psychosis. So for me, it was not the intensity of the work with clients that burned me out. It was the moral injury, so to speak. So suddenly I started seeing and hearing things that other people didn't see or hear, started having, what gets called delusions or hallucinations. And the first instance is kind of an important one to what I'll go on to talk about in terms of the mind-body connection. So my first break, so to speak, was I was alone in my room at home in New York City, and I suddenly started to see these entities, these beings, what I thought were demons, who were trying to poke holes in my gut. And I genuinely felt like there were holes in my gut, and I ran to try to escape them. And my roommates found me in that state. And what I learned later on, maybe about 3 months later, was that I also had an undiagnosed autoimmune disease. And even though no doctor had really been able to tell me this up until that point, the demons kind of were, I believe, was kind of my mind trying to tell me that there was something viscerally wrong, that there were indeed, this was before the language around the colloquial term leaky gut, but that they were trying to tell me, my mind was trying to tell me that there were indeed holes in my gut lining. I actually suffered before that from stomach ulcers and all kinds of things. And once I addressed the underlying autoimmune disease, things started to also get easier. Now, in my, analysis of psychosis in general, and I went on to work with many folks in psychosis, both in private practice and also through the parachute program, the open dialogue approach, through all of that, I've really seen that there are so many complex interrelating underlying factors to an experience such as psychosis. And so for me, it was many things. I had many states that also allowed me to understand and process my trauma in a deeper way. I had hallucinations and delusions that seemingly had a bit of a wisdom to them. So for me, trauma processing psychosis was giving me information about the state of my body. It was also a deep spiritual experience for me at the time, and it led me to make many, many life changes. And I should say also that, I have a lot of privilege. I consider myself so lucky that at the time, because of my work in the mental health system, I was able to avoid the psychiatric ward. And during that whole time, I was not on medications, and I was not receiving clinical treatment in that way, because despite the pain and the severity of it, I was able to gather scrappily some peer support and some people to support me through that time.
You share in your chapter that you draw on a multiplicity of frameworks for making sense of your own experience and also other people's. I wonder if you could just walk us through the five you outline in the chapter and how they connect and also draw from your own lived experience.
I'm sure a lot of people at this point are aware that trauma is one of the major, key factors that can lead to psychosis. So the trauma framework is definitely one of them. And like I said, I believe that not only does trauma lead to psychosis, but psychosis can also be in some way the body-mind's way of processing trauma, revealing really important, perhaps sometimes hidden information about the trauma. Related to trauma, I do think that there's more and more research and interest in ancestral or intergenerational trauma as well. And that was a huge factor for me too. I'm someone who has also deep spiritual practices and connect quite often to my ancestors and ancestry. But this experience was something that I think really kicked that off in a more major way. And I started to understand that not only my individual and familial trauma was at play, but also many generations back, and that it was still living in and through me. The third framework that I drew on is, again, this mind-body connection or psychoneuroimmunology. There's a lot of research now about just how deeply intertwined psychosis and autoimmune disease is. Autoimmunity increases your risk of having a psychotic episode. And also, if you are labeled with psychosis or schizophrenia, you're also much more likely to be hospitalized for an autoimmune disease. And so diving into that research was really fascinating for me. And now I've seen, many folks who have recovered from psychotic episodes through things like metabolic or nutritional interventions addressing their autoimmune disease as well. And the fourth was a spiritual framework. So I say spiritual / existential because I think that anytime we're dealing with the mind or our mental health, there, so many inevitable questions come up around what is my life? Where do I go from here? Questions about death and transformation. And for me, this was a huge opportunity to deepen my spiritual practice and to receive guidance through that.
It reminded me of the really powerful experience you had around being carried and put into a coffin, extremely existential. Would you mind sharing more about that experience and then how you made meaning of that, maybe within a spiritual or existential framework?
Yeah, one of the quote unquote episodes that I had, I remember being unaware of where my body was in space and seeing these beings or entities come to me, and they were actually quite friendly. Some of my hallucinations or delusions were not quite as friendly. This one was, and they were encouraging me. They were cheering for me and saying, "We're so glad you're here." And they were beings who were kind of engaging in this ritual practice, and they led me and guided me into a coffin. They closed the lid, and naturally I was quite afraid of what I was seeing or experiencing. And they put the coffin into the river and sent me down the river. And at the kind of bottom of this river, other beings of this same group kind of took me out of the water, out of the coffin, and cheered for me or celebrated me. And one of the ways that I've made meaning of that experience was to understand that there were many, many parts of me that needed to die or that was ready to transition or, take new form. And there were many times throughout psychosis where I had this really terrifying, stark feeling of I'm going to die, or something is trying to kill me, or, just that incredible fear of death. And each time when I was able to relax into that and say, okay, maybe it is not my physical body that's going to die, but there's a part of me that wants to move on. That is when I found kind of this release of the suffering.
One of the other existential questions you raised in the chapter was this question of like, how much of this is me, the self and the quote unquote psychosis. and navigating sort of identity through these different frameworks. Is this as you talk about in the psychiatric narrative, is this some kind of, chemical imbalance that isn't me? Or is this something that is deeply personal, and me in the sense that it's connected to my ancestry and experiences of structural oppression and things like that? I wonder if you could say a little bit more about this question that you are holding around, what's me and what isn't, in this experience.
Yeah, I think the other piece in this spiritual existential framework that I've noticed that a lot of psychosis survivors also carry with them long after, through like what I call the integration period. So maybe you're not actively seeing or hearing things, but you're kind of then wondering after such a crisis, how do I deal with this? There's kind of this feeling of this thin-skinnedness, of this boundarylessness between yourself and the world, or yourself and other people. A lot of folks also describe, and I experienced myself, it was like I could feel too much of everything around me, like this blending of me and everything else, and it was like my identity just completely dissolved. And when someone asked me any kind of question relating to who I was as an individual, I had no idea how to answer that question for quite some time afterwards. Um, and I think that's also a really challenging but important part of the process. Also, um, there's a line from Thomas More, and I won't get the quote exactly right, but he talks about, he's a existential psychologist, and he talks about how with any kind of mental health concern, there's necessary changes that it's asking you to make. And so for me, I viewed that in some ways as, just really asking myself, like, what is this experience asking of me? And in some ways, it was asking me to develop some better boundaries and to get much more grounded. I had to move away from the city. I had to move upstate. I got interested in herbalism. I couldn't read existential philosophy for some time. I joke about that, but I mean, really, it was a huge turning point in my life. And I think, for me, my spirit was asking me to make some necessary changes.
And I'm aware I didn't let you finish on the fifth modality that you walked through. Can you pick up on that one for us?
Yeah, and the fifth is through the lens of structural oppression. So that can relate to all of the other ones, right? Because our physical health deteriorates when we experience structural oppression. That's connected to ancestral or intergenerational trauma, what our ancestors experienced, including like enslavement and displacement and all kinds of things. And so I really had to reckon not only with the oppression that I faced, but also then again with this moral injury of then being put in a situation where I was being asked to recreate that oppression for other people, and to kind of be, an agent of oppression within mental health systems that I believe were not adequately serving people in any way.
You connect the structural oppression piece also, like you just mentioned, to the ancestral trauma, intergenerational trauma. Can you tell us a little bit more about your connection, your ancestry in Hawaii, and how that felt connected to what you were experiencing at that time?
Yeah. So I'm a mixed race Filipina and German woman. So my ancestors are the people who raised me were my grandparents, and they were both first generation immigrants. My grandmother from Germany, my grandfather from the Philippines. And what was most highlighted for me through psychosis was the oppression that my Filipina ancestors experienced. So my grandfather and his family were essentially indentured servants who were taken from the Philippines to work on pineapple and sugarcane companies in Hawaii for the U.S. And they were promised all kinds of things, adequate housing and education, all of these things. And so I was lucky enough to be able to have spoken with my grandfather before he died where he finally opened up about some of these stories of things that he experienced, the racism. And I also got to hear in his voice the way that he so deeply internalized the racism and oppression that he faced. For example, he would always say things like, he would describe the circumstances that he faced, but then would always say, but I was stupid, or don't be like me. Or this like pressure to get educated, to be good enough, this kind of imposter syndrome also that I think I inherited from that side of the family. So these experiences within psychosis also led me to more deeply understand that side of my ancestry, which I had been so deeply disconnected from, because even though I was raised by him in his home, my German ancestry took precedence. I was only told German stories. I was raised to kind of blend in with whiteness. And my grandfather was very afraid of bringing any element of, his ancestry or culture into the room, because he was really taught to keep silent about it. So, yeah, and ultimately it helped me to uncover parts of myself and my cultural history that I would not have otherwise.
I found in my clinical work and also in my own experience that there's a sort of recurring theme that feels almost unprompted, but where there's sort of like disowned parts of ancestry, of family history that seem to emerge and almost speak in a unique voice that feels outside of the person's known identity in some way. Is that something you find in your work with people experiencing these states as well? And how do you make sense of that, how that tends to come up so consistently?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially in recent years in my private practice, I've also really been more focused on drawing out some of those experiences and asking about people's ancestry. One of the things I've noticed is that one of the potential markers that there's something intergenerational happening is when there's maybe a thought, a behavior, a big emotion, something that someone maybe is not able to connect with anything happening in real time. And they're just like, I have no idea why I'm experiencing this. It does not logically make sense. And that's usually when I'll ask about ancestry or culture. I do find in almost sometimes an interesting, almost mystical way, there are ways that we almost recreate some of our ancestors' experiences through our own lives. But it's also a huge healing opportunity. It's like a traumatic reenactment, but instead of just within our own lives, across our ancestors' lives.
Yeah, we talk about repetition psychoanalytically or in trauma and recovery, and think about the ways that there's like traumatic recreation across generations seems also to lend itself to making sense of some of these experiences people live through. Just follow up a little bit more on your clinical work. You mentioned being involved in the Parachute Project and bringing open dialogue to the US. And our readers will know that Mad in America has covered the Parachute Project for a while in this attempt to bring open dialogue to the US and some of the obstacles it faced in implementing that. I'm wondering if you could share more about what your experience was on those teams and what worked and what got in the way.
I wish too that I had had the opportunity to work there for longer, but it was only a short time because we lost our funding. And I think one of the biggest challenges that open dialogue has faced in being implemented in the US is just that these, big conglomerate nonprofits who are trying to, offer mental health services, not only do they have to abide by regulations and insurance company regulations and things, but also there's not always adequate advocacy within higher ups to advocate for particular programs. And I think that was really the case with open dialogue. People outside of the team didn't know why the heck we were there or what we were doing, right? So that was, I think, one of the biggest challenges. But for me, it was a really healing experience because after quitting home-based crisis in much more of a hierarchical role, I decided that I didn't want to work in that kind of hierarchy. I wanted to work as a peer specialist. So I got trained as a peer specialist, worked in this program. And yeah, for me, it was really healing to be able to work from a place of mutuality. I'm sure other practitioners have said this too, because people are expecting you to come in with the answers. People are expecting you to come in with, medication management and all of these kind of more traditional things, especially the parents or the family members of the person who's identified and as the lived experiencer. And yeah, it was always so interesting to get to really utilize the open dialogue principles of needing to go in and tolerate the uncertainty of just being with the person who is in crisis. And it also really showed me just how healing that is. People always think, it must be some complex array of medications and this and that and all these things, and it can be. But at the same time, I think the most essential ingredient is that being with quality. Yeah, so I would love to see open dialogue in many more places.
I think this gets us in our timeline to the founding of IDHA.
Yes.
Can you tell our listeners a bit about your involvement in founding IDHA, what the goals were, and what it's grown to be?
As I mentioned, working in that more traditional crisis system, my jaw was on the floor, just really shocked and also looking around to try to see where my allies were, like who else was experiencing this. And so after I felt well enough after my first episode, I started to really think about how I wanted to use my energy towards advocacy or activism. And so I joined the New York City Icarus project at the time and really, found other people who were thinking through this and actually found that there had been people thinking through this for a long time, the MAD movement and, people who had been doing this advocacy work. And I got really excited. And through the Icarus project, made some really great collaborations and started doing workshops in different areas. At some point, I did a workshop on psychiatric advance directives. And Peter Stastny, a radical psychiatrist, happened to be in the room. And he came up to me afterwards and said, I think we both have a deep investment in education or in, educating people on different modalities in mental health. And do you want to maybe do something together? And yeah, that's what we did. We put our heads together and we both had this shared passion and understanding that there are already so many strategies and modalities that exist, but a lot of mental health professionals and advocates and family members don't know about them. And how do we get this information to people? Because like I said, I believe that mental health counselors and social workers, we want to be effective. We want to feel like our work actually matters. We want to truly, address people's deeper needs. But people weren't really getting that kind of education. We were getting the education that says, people have a biomedical brain disease and all you do is, case management. So, he pulled together a bunch of folks in his network and I did from mine, and we collaborated and started our first training. And a bunch of folks attended and found that it was actually addressing a need in the community. Neither of us ever really expected to start a nonprofit. I don't think we were, it was just kind of this very scrappy project. And I was really young at the time. And I remember kind of being in the room and, all of these folks in the movement who I had read their work or, heard of, they were all kind of looking at me like, all right, Jazmine, like, what do we do? How do we do this? And so, yeah, we just got more trainings off the ground, and, more amazing people joined. And we also, at the time, were a very white led organization, and we're not doing things right. And other folks came in and said, hey, we need to have an anti racist lens and an anti oppression lens, and we need to be really centering the most marginalized. And so we went through a lot of restructuring and strategic visioning and planning. And yeah, today the Institute is, I think, over 8 years old now. And we went from being New York City oriented to having international scope and audiences. We now have a huge online training that is the transformative mental health core curriculum, which combines, lessons from over 50 experts, many of whom have been on the Mad in America podcast, and amazing folks. So yeah, I always say I kind of grew up in and through IDHA, pretty much learned everything that I know now from all of those amazing people.
A lot of these people also contribute to the new Mad Studies reader.
Yes.
And you mentioned that one of the things that was really exciting was when you realized there was this long history of folks who had been having similar thoughts, similar experiences, similar critiques of the system. Can you share a little bit about the rich history of Mad Studies, and then why this book now?
The Mad movement is really complex, and I think kind of an ever shifting group. And in terms of also for Mad Studies, the scope and the questions that people are asking. But what I will say is that, the Mad movement, I think many folks who are invested in this work also know, came out of multiple different movements. What was called the Consumer Survivor Ex-Patient movement also came out of disability justice movements, LGBTQIA movements, and really it was very strong in the 60s and 70s. But at some point, I believe there was a shift from directly kind of attacking or critiquing psychiatry from an anti-psychiatry perspective to really asking more questions around not, is madness or is mental health real or not, but more who gets to decide what madness is, and how is power shared or not shared in these spaces? Questions around epistemic justice, questions around how we know what it means to be mad, questions around our culture, and questions of normal versus abnormal. And so Mad Studies, I think, has a really broad scope at this time, but one of the reasons why I feel very excited about Mad Studies is because it's very emergent, and there are many different stakeholders. And I'm always, especially with IDHA too, what we really wanted to do was to gather people with lived experience and people with quote unquote professional experience. And that was what was really missing in mental health trainings. And I think quite similarly, Mad Studies is highly interdisciplinary. There are researchers, clinicians from many different fields and disciplines, as well as activists, artists, lived experiencers. So for me, that bridge building, I think, is really exciting about it. And also the element that, really knowing and recognizing there was a time before, for example, disability studies was a thing. There was a time before women's studies was a thing. Now you can go into your local, maybe anarchist bookshop, maybe not a normal bookshop, but you can go at least into your local anarchist bookshop and find whole sections with many books on these topics. And I would like to see a world where we can do that with a whole Mad Studies section.
You mentioned that the interdisciplinarity of the movement is huge. That seems connected to this idea of epistemic justice, that these questions that you've outlined for us about what is madness and who gets to decide, that there are people within the Mad Studies movement who maybe hold very different sort of ideas about that. There's even within the sort of lived experience world of people who identify as mad, or people as psychiatric survivors or as consumers or service users and other sort of all these different perspectives, it seems like an important part of the movement has been able to just hold open space for that question to not be filled in by someone other than yourself as you kind of process that. So yeah, I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the importance of the interdisciplinarity. You have that in the reader, these sections for artists, sections for lived experience, critical scholars, clinicians, and how that's connected to this idea of epistemic justice.
Folks who are labeled as mad or with mental health concerns have always been excluded from any kind of scholarly, relationship to defining their experiences. Automatically, I think sanism is really one of the, maybe not the last for sure, but one of the remaining isms that we are just so completely not willing to talk about. I think, thankfully, anti-racism is becoming a bigger part of the picture, especially in MAD studies or the MAD movement, because I think for a long time it wasn't present. But sanism is something, just by virtue of being considered mad, you're considered irrational, illogical, not able to make decisions for yourself, not able to engage in discourse around your experiences. And I think that that's slowly shifting, but that's this piece on epistemic justice. Who gets to speak about, who gets to be part of the knowledge creation process? And this is both in institutions like academia, which is very slow moving on that front. Although there are obviously many lived experiencers who are also within academia as well. But this is also true, I think, in other areas or other spheres. So the interdisciplinarity, the kind of ally building nature of it, I think is really crucial. And I've always been curious myself, who are we missing? Like, who are we excluding from the conversation? But also, even in activist movements and, mad studies movements, are there folks that we don't know yet or disciplines that we can kind of connect with that might also support us in some of these questions?
There seems to be something rich in the sort of typical clinical perspective that madness or psychosis is a sort of closing down of reality. It's a sort of idea that this thing that I believe is disconnected from reality is the truth without being able to tolerate other sort of perspectives on that. And here in MAD studies, there's this sort of rich openness to multiple perspectives, all the way from an artist perspective on what's going on to a neuroscience perspective. Like you're building a big bridge there. While it seems that sort of traditional movements in the fields are the ones claiming that there's the one way of understanding this. So there's a sort of ironic flip, I think. So speaking of that sort of bridge, you talked about interdisciplinarity and your own reaching from MAD studies to critical neuroscience. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey in that way and what you're finding?
My curiosity here came from first acknowledging that kind of rigidity or dogmatism, I think, can happen across the board. It definitely happens in, traditional biomedical spaces, but it can also happen, in MAD movements, in MAD activism as well. This rigidity, and so, the chapter in the MAD Studies reader that I wrote is really about holding the multiplicity, even just in myself and how I came to understand this experience for myself. And I also, at the same time, started seeing more and more clients who were at this intersection of chronic illness and mental health concerns. And I started to question, is this really common? And it turns out that it is. There's not a ton of research on this, but it seems as though maybe 60 to 70% of folks who have a mental health concern also have a chronic illness, a physiological illness. And the lines are really blurry because, we have bodies, we live in the world. And I got really curious about this disability justice perspective, and also seeing how there were actually some interventions that I saw work for folks that were purely physiological in nature, that were supporting people with their mental health concerns. And like I said, that was also somewhat the case for myself. So it turned out that I had celiac disease, which is an autoimmune disease that's an allergic reaction to gluten or wheat proteins. And it turns out celiac makes up, like, folks who have celiac are at much higher risk for developing some kind of psychosis or having a psychotic episode. And this is really common and well documented in the research now. And so I also had a lot of clients who had other things like PANS or PANDAS, which is a viral onset OCD experience, usually as a child. There were all these other kind of really interesting realizations that I started to have about this mind-body connection. And I think that also, so even folks who aren't familiar with this, I think the connection piece can be, we've started to really understand that trauma is a huge, link to mental health concerns, right? But trauma does not just happen to our minds. Trauma happens to our bodies. It's the story of the body that's being revealed. And so starting to understand both philosophically and scientifically, this very mushy link between mind and body, or what we consider mental and what we consider physical, started to become really important to me. And neuroscience, I think, is asking some really interesting questions on that front. There's the mind-body problem, there's critical neuroscientific interventions, and I started in metabolic psychiatry and functional psychiatry, and I started to just really see that actually not the very rigid, like serotonin theory of depression, or it's our neurotransmitters that are going haywire, not that kind of biomedical disease model, but actually that critical neuroscientists essentially, I think, really agree with, or there's overlap between their kind of theories and research and what the MAD movement has been saying for some time. So I think modern critical neuroscience really emphasizes the environmental and context dependent aspect of our lives. A lot of critical neuroscientists have said, it really doesn't make any sense anymore to make this rigid distinction between nature and nurture. We're realizing more about neuroplasticity, having more systems thinking when it comes to the brain and body. So I don't know, I still have a long way to go and a lot of questions here, but for me, I find this fascinating. And yes, perhaps it is a big bridge that I'm trying to build here, but I'm finding it fascinating.
Can you share a little bit more with us about what you're doing nowadays and where you're headed in your studies and what your work looks like?
Yeah, what I'm doing nowadays. So again, I'm really excited about the MAD Studies reader coming out. It'll be out in around October of this year, and we will be having not only like a big launch event, or, I'll be having a bunch of folks on the Depthwork podcast who have been involved in the MAD Studies reader, but also it seems like we will be having a MAD Studies symposium, really bringing together some folks who are advocating for this work. So I hope that folks will join us. So it'll be online and accessible for folks. Yeah, I'm currently at the Berlin School of Mind and Brain. I live in Germany now as of the last 2 years. And so I'm interested in and invested in international organizing and finding some folks out here as well. I know that MAD in America has a big international scope too. So been finding that really interesting and exciting. Yeah, and also just again, my biggest question is like, where else can we make friends? Like, where else can we be doing this collaboration and linking between activism work and academic and clinical work? There's so much I think that we can be excited about now. There's so many really interesting interventions happening. And I think that right now it's a really critical time for psychiatry and mental health. There's so many ways that we're starting to think about things that we never have before. So I think that openness and curiosity is really important. Yeah, and I look forward to anyone who would like to connect with me more on any of these topics: psychosis, autoimmunity, mind-body connection, trauma. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on the Mad in America podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's lovely to talk to you.
Thank you for listening to the Mad in America podcast. For more news, views, and updates, visit madinamerica.com.